Welcome to the SNN.Network Summer Virtual Event. We are pleased to introduce the next presenter for today's event, James Mish, Chief Executive Officer of 22nd Century Group. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and just appreciate everybody's time today and the opportunity to talk with all you folks today. And what I thought I would do is, to the folks who aren't quite as familiar with 22nd Century, we'll get into a little bit about who we are and where we're going. But I really would like to turn right away to slide 3, if you would, Jeff. And really jump in with some of our key revenue-generating catalysts and upcoming milestones, because I get that question asked a lot. It's a fair question, especially in the biotechnology world and with 22nd Century. So I really wanted to lay out a framework of what's on our threshold as far as key milestones and key catalysts, because we've got multiple catalysts across multiple plant-based franchises that we're executing on, and I want to keep this really first and foremost in people's minds. And then we'll get into a bit more about how we're going about doing that and where we've come from. But we've got, as I said, multiple catalysts across now really 3 plant-based franchises. Our foundation, of course, is in tobacco and the mission to reduce the harm caused by smoking. In this regard, we're certainly furthest along, and some key catalysts and milestones we have and have made recent announcements on are pretty straightforward. Number 1, first and foremost, we continue to be highly confident and are preparing for a U.S. commercial launch based on receiving our MRTP, Modified Risk Tobacco Product, authorization from the FDA. As we've said many times, this is the first and only combustible reduced nicotine cigarette that will likely contain or have the MRTP moving forward. And we firmly believe that we are in this documentation phase, having passed through the scientific phase. That documentation phase takes time. It's a large dossier, and certainly FDA wants to get it right. But we're highly confident that's the phase we're in, and we've been working hard to get fully prepared for the U.S. commercial launch of that product. We have contact with them on a regular basis through multiple channels, and that continues to drive the confidence in the right direction. And we also are in constant contact with U.S.-based retailers and channel partners that we are fully prepared to move on. So that's one of the initial catalysts that are on our threshold and moving forward with. Now, as we have wrapped up the preparations over the past year to prepare for the U.S. launch, we've continued to look on offshore opportunities into countries that would not require the MRTP, but still allow us to put our marketing claim forward of a 95% less nicotine. And there are several countries that we have had identified, continued to work on, engage with commercial retail partners, and are initiating that launch process across those countries. And as we've said at the last earnings call, we anticipate the revenue stream and the getting into those international markets by Q1 of 2022. Now, as we get the U.S.-based MRTP and secured, that opens up additional countries on a global basis. So there is a growing likelihood that we will be executing on this in parallel, starting with the offshore country opportunities that do not require MRTP, followed closely with the MRTP authorization and the U.S. commercial launch, and then right behind that, additional countries on a global basis. So multiple catalysts, even within tobacco, and multiple revenue-generating milestones on our threshold. Beyond that, we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about what else we're going to be doing and the work and activity we're doing in the tobacco area. Let me just pivot over a moment to hemp cannabis. We've talked a lot about the completion of our operating partnership network, all the way from identification of how cannabinoids work in the endocannabinoid and phytocannabinoid human system through our partnership with Canametrics, expansions with KeyGene, going into 4 alkaloid-based plant breeders, the best in the world that know how to not only breed cannabis, but disruptive cannabis lines based on the alkaloid components of the plant itself. And then moving into our own cultivation and networking with other cultivators through our breeder network. I can't stress enough how critical these breeders are to bring disruptive technology to the market. And in general, consumer-based products, there are breeding capabilities, but they use fairly antiquated breeding methodologies in comparison to this particular network. And they have focused on smaller scale cannabinoids versus being able to do this at large scale. These breeders that we have signed up with and are moving forward with enable us to bring extremely disruptive plant strains at commercial scale in greenhouses or on the farm. And that is revolutionary for the hemp cannabis business across all the end use markets, including pharmaceutical, medical OTC, recreational, and the consumer product space. As I said before, now that we have the engine in place and it is operating, we continue to anticipate revenue streams from this and milestones by Q4 of this year. And that'll be based on both our original IP, the Anandia IP, upfront licensing opportunities, plus additional upfront licensing opportunities from new plant strains, plus the additional revenue from our first grow that's going extremely well in Needle Rock, Colorado, and we anticipate that harvesting in October, November, and then moving it as flower and or distillate and or isolate. And the further along you go, the higher margins and the higher up the value chain you go. So going very well on the cannabis side. Those two combined, as you can see, are north of an $800 billion size of the prize, and that's what the foundation and the first expansion of the company certainly is focused on. Within roughly 1.5 weeks, on August 30th, we'll be introducing and announcing our third franchise. Very adjacency in the technology and the plant basis. It allows us to leverage our entire existing infrastructure that we built for hemp and cannabis. And it has a much lower barrier to entry into these commercial markets on a regulatory basis and much easier channels on a global basis. And we'll be detailing that on August 30th in short order. That in of itself adds another $500 billion worth of size of the prize, bringing our total market opportunity to $1.3 trillion. So again, I wanted to stress, we've got revenue milestones coming. We've got multiple catalysts on truly a global basis because this allows for global expansion as well, such as we did into the Canadian market, such as we're doing with the VLN offshore market launches. And you'll see that as well resonate when we announce the third plant franchise on August 30th. Slide 4, please. So on slide 4 and the next few slides, I just want to reiterate to those who don't know much about 22nd Century what the size of the prize is here in tobacco. And in essence, it's a massive cigarette market, and in matter of fact, 2 out of 3 of adult smokers want to quit. Our product that has the reduced levels of nicotine to non-addictive levels per the FDA guidelines really sets up those smokers for another tool in order to help drive the harm reduction caused by nicotine-based standard cigarettes. It's a massive market. We have the opportunity just in the U.S. With minimal CapEx requirement to service up to 3% of the volume. And of course, this is going to be offered as a premium priced cigarette as a tool to reduce the exposure to nicotine. And that's really the VLN storyline, the narrative all along. And that is our primary mission. Next slide, please. I won't go through this line by line, but at the end of the day, VLN really does offer a unique opportunity to the marketplace. It's in line with the FDA guidelines as far as what they want to see on reduced harm, reduced exposure, and also lines up well with considerations around menthol mandates, as well as potential nicotine mandates that's still very much in the works. But the discernible adult smoker benefits you can see on the right, that's really what hammers the opportunity home. Reduced nicotine exposure, smoke fewer cigarettes per day. There's reduced withdrawal symptoms, minimum or no compulsory smoking, and the increased number of smoke-free days. All this is in line with FDA studies, and in particular, also the PMTA authorization that we got back in 2019. So again, the only thing we're really waiting for is that MRTP that enables us to put on the label, on the package, 95% less nicotine. And that's the stage of the process we're in when we refer to the report or dossier preparation or documentation phase. Next slide, please. This gives you a bit of a visual of the marketing information that is being put together. Again, we will move forward with this, as we've indicated, into offshore launches as Q4 unfolds. And again, I'll reiterate that we anticipate being in market and generating revenue by Q1 of 2022, followed by the U.S. launch and then ultimately additional offshore launches with MRTP. All the activity required for launch is complete. That cuts across supply chain, that cuts across retail channel partners, et cetera. Everything's ready to go within 90 days of receiving that FDA MRTP authorization. In fact, we can well come in within that 90 days timeline at this point. Slide 8, please, Jeff. Once again, we've targeted offshore international launches. Why? Because as time has gone on, and at least with the PMTA in place, there are well-recognized countries, well-recognized markets with premium cigarette markets well-established and smokers who want to quit well-established already in place. And these particular countries do not specifically require the MRTP to launch with our marketing claim on it. So we've not identified those specific countries for competitive reasons, but as the time gets closer to actually being on the shelves in the market, obviously we'll be talking more about them as we'll be in market and visible. But we are keeping that close to the vest in order to protect our competitive position. But we are already growing additional VLN cigarette tobacco in preparation for that launch. We had done that in the past, not only for the U.S. launches, but also for the potential of offshore launches. And we're also now growing that in the Southern Hemisphere to help support both launches as they come into play. Both launches meaning offshore as well as the U.S. launch. So let me just go to the next slide and talk a little bit about hemp cannabis in the remaining time we've got. Again, we've completed this operational network. The photo on the slide here is taken actually a few weeks ago on Needle Rock Farm. If I showed you a photo now, the plants are about twice that size and are very well filled in. These are next generation strains that have ultra-high levels of CBD and ultra-high levels of CBG and ultra-low levels of THC. In fact, they're extremely attractive to the market, and as I said before, we were actually oversold this year with off-take commitments for all these products. The only debate we're having now is, are we going to sell it as flower? Are we going to sell some as distillate? And we're looking at some new technology around the distillate capabilities that's very unique to the industry. Or do we go all the way to the isolate or something in between? But the further you go up that stream, the higher the margin's going to be. And obviously, we want to optimize the margins from our initial grow here. So a lot of that is based on the original Anandia IP, which is also a revenue generation for us here coming up in Q4. But the important walkaway is we have spent the last year putting together all the pieces of the operational partnerships to drive not only this, but the third franchise as well, because it's a drop-in into that same network. Slide 11 just gives you a bit more visual about the network itself, and I've talked a lot about this. Every one of these groups are top shelf representatives of their expertise anywhere from a knowledge base in canometrics to genetics with key gene to alkaloid-based plant breeding that includes cannabis, includes the third franchise, includes tobacco for that matter, and includes the overarching alkaloid-based plant biotechnology, and then ultimately into plant cultivation and purification and extraction. So that is all in place and operating very well, at least in the initial stages. As we get into next year, it'll really be unchained. Just the next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just a snapshot of our financials, primarily our cash and cash equivalents. We're in a very strong financial position from a cash basis. We continue to drive revenue streams, not only about everything I've talked about, but our contract manufacturing operations down in the Carolinas is a growing part of our profitability. We're looking to expand there. You've seen recent announcements with new business coming in and line of sight to at least 3 additional large opportunities coming in before the end of this year, which will really make that facility a profit generator even without VLN in it. Obviously, once VLN is up and running, the profit generation is exponential. So we have great financial position and certainly great operating efficiencies driving us. We are a plant-based biotechnology company, so we are now targeting and refining exactly when we'll become cash positive and obviously profit positive shortly beyond that. But we'll be talking about that more in upcoming discussions. And finally, on slide 14, and then we can get into some Q&A. This is a snapshot of our 21 priorities and areas of focus. Critical thing to remember here is we've been very consistent. These have been and are our primary focus. I've talked through every one of these and the progress we've made to date. And as we get into the end of this month, we'll be adding to this, obviously, more detail around the third plant franchise and sharing as much information as we can. Given the competitive nature of it, it'll be an ongoing process, but we'll be sharing quite a bit of information on August 30th across all different aspects of that business. And with the remaining roughly 10 minutes, I'll open it up for questions and ask Jeff to help out with that, if you would, sir.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Our first question is, what are some of the catalysts for the company for the rest of 2021 and going into 2022?
Well, as I said in the opening, that first slide really sets the stage. There are multiple catalysts that are becoming more and more global in nature. I will say that as well. And if I boil it down just to the remainder of Q3 and Q4, the hemp cannabis upfront licensing revenues, along with the first grow revenue stream coming in, will certainly be the first indicators in that area. The offshore VLN launches will be shortly behind that, or maybe in parallel. Our ongoing, remember, our contract manufacturing business continues to go very much in the right direction. Additional business coming on is also anticipated there. And those are really the primary drivers, I would say, as we get into Q3, 4, and Q1 of next year. And then beyond that, just to set the right expectations, the third franchise will be about 12 to 18 months, probably closer to 12 months before revenue generation once we announce it.
Thanks. Our second question, do you feel that the 90-day window after MRTP authorization will be cut shorter considering the delay on the MRTP authorization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the best way to answer it is we have dotted every I, crossed every T on the launch process. That includes the pilot launch as well as a broader launch. And as time has gone on, the line between those two gets smaller and smaller. So I would anticipate that we'll be launching well within the 90 days. We've set that to hopefully set expectations, but we're so prepared to go, certainly in the U.S. launch, and we'll be learning a lot in the offshore launches, as we're in progress with those already. that will also cut down on that time. So I can't give an exact date, but I think it's very safe to say that we'll take a big bite out of that 90-day window once the authorization is in hand.
Thanks, Jim. Our next question is, a company, Amorous, is currently selling CBG direct to consumers using a biosynthetic pathway described in their patent application that blatantly infringes on patents 22nd Century Group owns the rights to. Do you have any comments on that? Do you plan on acting soon, or are you going to let them carry out with the infringement?
So I won't comment specifically to Amorous, but I will. It's a great question, and I'll comment so everyone understands a bit better, what's happening in the overarching marketplace. That, the original Anandia IP that 22nd Century licensed and is now shared with Aurora. The primary design of that technology was for what I call a pure biosynthetic process, the fermentation process, to go from, in essence, cheap sugars through yeast and enzymes to specific cannabinoids, CBD, CBG, or what have you. 22nd Century doesn't necessarily follow that pure play biosynthetic process. We take that same intellectual property and utilize the plant and modulate the plant on a cellular basis to do that, right? Now, Aurora, as it had been developing and changed over management, they had also kind of shelved that technology and were focusing more on a natural plant-based approach. In the meantime, there's been about a dozen to 15 of these groups who have gone out and commercialized that pure fermentation play that we do believe infringes upon our patents, and we are working with Aurora very closely and collaboratively to go out and protect and defend that IP, and to each and every one of those who we believe are infringing it. So I can't get into the details of that for obvious reasons, but I think suffice it to say that the primary connectivity that we have with Aurora specific to that original Anandia IP is to protect and defend it and secure whatever we're entitled to on a revenue basis or licensing basis or a royalty basis with the success it's been in the marketplace, and continue to drive it forward that way. So I can't say much more than that, but that's very much in progress, and between Aurora and ourselves, we're taking it very seriously.
Great, Jim. Thanks. Our next question is, the third franchise reveal coming up on August 30th. Is that still dependent on MRTP approval? If not, what has changed?
No, the third franchise is not dependent on MRTP. It's a different plant. It is an alkaloid-based plant, but MRTP is a tobacco franchise consideration and nothing more. So no, the third franchise really does not depend on that. In fact, as I said before, from a regulatory barrier basis, when you compare it to tobacco and certainly cannabis and hemp, the regulatory barriers, legislative barriers are very low, and it really boils down to our core thesis, which is bringing disruptive plant strains to bear in that particular plant line in a very large and growing market that's really ripe for disruption. That market, as will be identified on the 30th, is ripe for disruption. It falls right into our wheelhouse as far as strengths are concerned, timeliness of getting new strains developed, and disruptive type of technologies that improve yields and disease resistance and additional consumer benefits that we'll talk more about. But to answer the question crisply, it does not whatsoever depend on MRTP.
Thanks, Jim. We've reached the end of the Q&A session. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, first of all, thank you to everyone for their time. Hopefully you get to know 22nd Century a bit better during this process. And I'll just close the way I opened. It's an exciting time for the company. We put together a strategic plan, about a little over a year and so ago. The plan has really not changed one iota. We're executing across it. It's setting up the company for multiple catalysts across now multiple geographies and multiple end-use markets, all of which are sizable and growing, and very consistent with one another, going from one franchise to the next. So if you take a look at the opportunities in that consumer product space, in the pharmaceutical space, in the medical OTC space, the recreational space, it gives us exposure to every one of those global markets in every geography of the world, and takes it back to our value proposition, which is a very methodical and faster path, disruptive plant lines on the plant biotechnology. And as we need to, in the case of VLN, we'll drive a brand forward, but our business model is to really license that technology and take advantage of the upswing in revenue based on partnering with groups that have faster channels to market. So the company is very well positioned in end-use markets, in geographies, and a disruptive value proposition. And in addition to that, we've shored up our financial position and operating efficiency. Everything is firing on all cylinders, and we're looking forward to introducing you to the third franchise in about a week and a half, and the launches that we've just talked about. So I appreciate the time and appreciate your interest in 22nd Century. And with that, I'll sign off and wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the 22nd Century Group presentation. Thank you for joining us. You may now disconnect.